All right, boys and girls, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about GM's inevitable demise that they've caught themselves into. They've backed themselves into a corner, if you will, and they've done it to themselves, but their demise is kind of coming from China, but kind of coming from inside the house, if you will. They are in for it. So in 2027, a contract is expiring that's going to really show GM's full hand, full cards, and I think we're all gonna see what happens. I think GM is playing a weird game right now. Once I learned about all this, and once you learn about all this, it's gonna be hard to look at GM the same way because there's some weird stuff going on, and it all revolves around SAIC, SAIC. It's a Chinese automaker that partnered with GM in 1999 when they found, or 1997 when they founded, and they were kind of a 50-50 partnership with GM, and we're going to get into the whole story. So, in 2009, so I guess let's go back a little bit more. So in 97, they started to help GM get into China. China's a huge market. GM wanted to get into it. They kind of got into it with Buick, really, with the Regal, and there was a GL8 minivan and a couple other things. China became the second largest single market for General Motors, selling 201,000 vehicles and 81% market increase over the previous year. In that year, SAIC GM achieved a 13% market share in mainland China, second to only Volkswagen, and sales dropped in 2004 when the company retired one of their Buicks, and they started to replace it with Chevy stuff. And then they introduced the Cadillac brand to China, and it was kind of starting to really work out. They completed construction of a new plant in 2005. They're really ramping up this GM SAIC partnership in China. That's what this was all really about, and they were producing a lot of cars in China. They were Chinese cars carrying the GM namesakes, from the Buick to the Cadillac and things like that. You always hear China loves Buicks. It's kind of because they make them in China on Chinese soil, and they're Chinese cars. We even now imported a lot of those into the US. There's a lot of Chinese Buicks and Cadillacs running around, and people don't even realize. They were selling in like 2006, they're selling like 400,000 vehicles a year, which is a lot of cars to sell in the Chinese market. And by 2011, they sold 1.2 million cars. But it all started to really go south for GM in 2009, and they started to make a bed that they couldn't really, what would be the analogy there? Like, they're making their bed starting in 2009. So everybody knows 2009, GM received a $50 billion US government bailout. But at the same time, GM secretly sells 1% golden share to SAIC for $85 million, giving SAIC control of the joint venture. Now, the joint venture was the Chinese segment, which was not just the Chinese segment, it was the control over the sales in China and India and large markets like that. And some other, so SAIC gains 50% of all of that market, 51% now. Now, they have the controlling share. That 1% is very important in business. Then, in 2010, they signed a co-development deal for EVs, hybrids, and other platforms. GM shifts R&D over to China, and they start to really heavily train the Chinese teams and engineers, and the platforms are starting to shift to China. So a lot of GM stuff in 2010, the development of cars started to shift to China. Opel and Holden and those kind of things, engineers were trained in China. Obviously, Opel and Holden kind of changed a lot since then. And then in like 2011 to 2015, the global operations start to get gutted. GM exits a ton of key markets, but SAIC doesn't. GM stops selling in India, Australia, Russia, and a couple other deals. They sell off Opel and Vauxhall, and Chevy and GM start to get less of a globally recognized brand. And now this is when they start to lose some of their power as the development car, the developer and the owner of these cars, and more just become a marketing tool for SAIC, because Chevy and GM have the brand recognition, SAIC doesn't. So they're basically just using them to kind of funnel cars out to the world, because people will buy Chevys, people will buy GM. So SAIC was kind of just using them to get their foot in the door and get these cars out to market. And then by 2016, that's when the Chinese cars start to hit US soil. And these are fully SAIC built cars at this point. They are the Buick Envision becomes the first Chinese car sold in like 2016. The Cadillac CT6 plug-in hybrid is also imported from China, and a couple other GMs. And there's about 30,000 vehicles imported annually from 2016. And it's been ramping up since then. The GM Bolt was fully built by LG Tech. No GM development EVs in the US. US EV strategy for GM kind of stalls around that time, and SAIC surges in EV innovation, whereas before they kind of wanted GM tech. Now their tech has surpassed SAIC, because GM spent all the money to, build up SAIC's engineering and design team and development team, while GM's own team was shrinking. So they kind of were handing over the reins, outsourcing it to the Chinese company, which was done by their own greed, and it's starting to fall apart now. You probably already see how it's starting to fall apart. The Mexico Gateway, GM begins importing Chinese-designed cars built in Mexico. So the Equinox EV, the Blazer EV are Chinese designs that they built in Mexico to bring in, so that they were tariff-free entry into the U.S. market. GM quietly becomes SAIC's Western distribution channel. That's the important part, is GM kind of lost their own personality, and SAIC kind of took them over as, this is what you're going to sell because this is what we built, and we'll just put a bow tie on it, and there you go, or put the Buick badge on it, here you go. And you're probably seeing that. You probably have seen these cars. They don't feel like a GM. A lot of them don't. They feel like a Chinese counterpart. And I've said this before, a lot of these SUVs, you kind of look at them and you're like, that feels Chinese. And I think the Blazer EV and the Equinox EV feel like that same feel. Then GM Chinese market share drops from 15% to 7% from 2021 to 2024 as SAIC introduces the MG brand that they purchased. It's MG. I mean, it's like a British brand or whatever that came from. And that starts to outsell GM because they had that controlling 51 share. So they just started pushing their cars, letting the GM stuff slide away, and then GM loses billions. Their global footprint shrinks so much just from these little things. And then that's when we get to where we're at now, where the warning signs start to go off. It's like, whoa, we lost GM. Like, that's what the executives have to be thinking right now. It's like, we lost our identity because we sold it to the lowest bidder, aka China, to get cheaper vehicles. They say Chevy is fully exiting China. GM delays new Chinese models. Chinese sales collapse 76% year over year. It has a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, but GM actually argued that in one of the funniest ways possible, because they didn't think that their cars should get the same EV tariffs. They said in July 2018, they petitioned that tariff relief was necessary to help the Buick brand compete against foreign competitors in the US market, including Honda, Acura, Volkswagen, Audi, and Mercedes-Benz. Which is very funny that they said that, because their Buick was 100% Chinese made. Meanwhile, the Acura was made on US soil. And that's what they pulled. Now, you can talk about tariffs amongst yourselves, but it's funny to argue it on that stance. Is you're gonna stand there and say, well, wait, we need protection because of these foreigners. It's like, you're foreign. You're from China. What are you talking about? So, where it really explodes. Now, I know I clickbaited you a little bit, but it's actually exploding. So, in 2027 is when it happens. SAIC and GM had a joint venture that expires 30 years after signing. What do? Now, GM has lost a ton of its R&D. They've outsourced it. A lot of their engineers, they've outsourced it. A lot of their car building and production, they've outsourced. A lot of their pretty much everything, they've kind of fallen to like a marketing company. So what do? So they kind of have two choices. They try to renew with SAIC. They will probably lose, access to the Chinese tech that they helped develop, the IP, the manufacturing, potentially bankruptcy, maybe, likely. I mean, they're going to lose access to a lot of their cars if that happens. Or they renew and SAIC becomes the controller of the company, and GM becomes just a badge on the Chinese SAIC vehicles. They control, design, manufacturing, the whole nine, and it's just badge engineering at that point, and it's just like, here you go, you sell this Chevy now. It's like, what is this? Oh, well, we built it. One of those two things might happen. I mean, when their contract expires and Chevy's left with have outsourced so much of their stuff to this foreign Chinese company, and they did it to themselves. They actually did it to the taxpayers because it started happening right at the time they got this big bailout, and they gave that 1% up, that 1%, and then they kept funneling things to China to outsource to make it easier on themselves. They've kind of, like I said, backed themselves into this corner that is going to put them into a potential death. I mean, I hate to be like, oh, they're going bankrupt, because I don't know. They might be able to figure it out. I mean, they got a lot of money and a lot of teams. They build some cars on U.S. soil, but they have significantly put so much of their resource allocation into the SAIC deal and that partnership that I don't see how they climb out of this hole. Now, something that happened in 97 is going to come back to bite them, and that kind of how it works. We'll see what happens when the venture ends and who is left with what. But I think a lot of you guys have already seen the writing on the wall with some of the GM stuff, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens and who ends up with, who ends up with the bag, I guess. Could China just start importing vehicles through the GM name and make them Chevys? Are they going to end up with controlling stake? Are they going to go bankrupt because they don't have they just don't have the vertical integration, because they've given it up basically in a lot of ways to SAIC? Or what are we going to see? I mean, they just spent so much money on this new, they just spent almost $1 billion on a new V8 development program. Are they going to have a car to really put it in? Are they going to have the money to really make it happen? But you can't feel bad for them. They sold themselves out just for, just for the bonuses, just to keep the ball rolling. They sold themselves out to cut the bottom line, to not develop on U.S. soil, to make it cheaper. They exported, they offshored all of the development and free thinking. So that's where it's at. Hope you guys could follow. What do you guys think? Is this all one of those hocus pocus things, or do you guys think if we bookmark this and by 2027 we're going to see this deal expire and it's going to be crumbling down for GM? I hope not. I like GM. I'm a GM guy. But obviously the last couple of years of GM have been different than the GM I grew up with, but still a GM guy. We'll see what happens. Maybe they'll just be a Corvette company after all this. I wanted to add a little bit more closing context after listening to that video back. There was a couple things I wanted to kind of clarify. Yes, GM makes a lot of vehicles here. The Tahoe, the Silverado, some of their larger vehicles are made here. The Corvette obviously is made on U.S. soil. But 50% of all GMs sold in the last year are imported. They are imported vehicles. It's like somewhere around there. So, yes, they have a strong U.S. base. They have like 91,000 U.S. employees, 46,000 UAW employees, something like that, assembling vehicles in the US. But when 50% of their imported vehicles are likely controlled by an outside party, they can't survive on just what they have going in the US. They are reliant on that third party company's sake to continue to sell them and badge their vehicles. That's what it comes down to. A lot of the factories are non-GM, fully owned, so it'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds. But I didn't want to brush over that. GM does make, some of their higher ticket item vehicles still in the US, but they rely on their whole across the board thing. Maybe they'll just get a lot smaller. But thank you guys so much for watching. Like, follow, and subscribe, and I will see you next time.